Hello and welcome to Solomon's Cave. This weekend is Easter weekend, the weekend where Christians remember Jesus' death and celebrate his resurrection. In this video, I will not delve deeply into questions of historicity and theological significance, or at least not much. I will simply provide a relatively comprehensive list of all the relevant passages in the Bible that you can read in relation to Easter. So let's start with Palm Sunday, when Jesus enters Jerusalem on a donkey. This happened 1 week before Easter Sunday. You can read that story in Luke 19 verses 28 through 40. As reported, the people were singing, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord," which is a quote from Psalm 118 verse 26, and also "Glory in the highest," which is a generic expression of praise, but it is also found in Psalm 148 verse 1. And the whole ordeal is clearly meant as a reference to Zechariah 9 verse 9, where it talks about a king coming to Jerusalem on a donkey. Jesus then goes to the temple, and we get the famous scene of Jesus throwing out all the merchants from the temple. You can read this story in Luke 19 verse 45 through 48. As a justification, Jesus says, "It is written, 'My house shall be a house of prayer,' but you have made it into a robber's den." Here he combines two quotes from the Old Testament, namely Isaiah 56 verse 7 and Jeremiah 7:11. John describes this event at the beginning of his Gospel, but he adds that Jesus' disciples thought of Psalm 96 verse 9, "The zeal for your house will consume me." Then we focus on Judas, who makes plans to betray Jesus, as you can read in Luke 22 verses 3 through 6. Jesus, on the other hand, makes different plans. He instructs some of his disciples to prepare the Passover meal in Jerusalem in Luke 22 verses 7 through 13. This Passover meal was, as it is still today, a Jewish celebration and remembrance of the Exodus. See Exodus chapter 12 for the instruction of that celebration. Then the Gospel according to John mentions that before the meal, Jesus washes the feet of his disciples. You can read that in John 13 verses 1 through 20. During the Passover meal, Jesus gives that meal a completely new meaning. By making the Passover meal no longer about the Exodus and the Old Covenant as described in Exodus 24, but about the New Covenant that will be made in his blood. You can read this in Luke 22 verses 14 through 23. This new covenant is a reference to Jeremiah 31:31, where the prophet announces that God will institute a new covenant. And Jesus just claimed that this is it. Matthew and Mark mention that at the end of the meal, Jesus and his disciples sang a song. It is a Jewish custom to sing Psalms 113 and 114 before the Passover meal, and Psalms 115 through 118 after the meal. During the meal, Jesus also mentions that Peter will betray him later that evening. See Luke 22 verses 31 through 34. Then Jesus goes to the garden at the Mount of Olives, also called Getsemane, and he prays there. You can read that in Luke 22 verses 39 through 46. Some manuscripts of Luke, though not all of them, mention that Jesus was so afraid that he started to sweat blood. A very uncommon, but well-documented physical response to extreme stress. John, in chapter 18 verse 1, briefly mentions that Jesus crossed the brook Kidron. This is no doubt a reference to King David, who also had to cross the brook Kidron when he was fleeing for his usurping son Absalom. See 2 Samuel 15 verse 23 and the surrounding text. Then Judas comes in and he betrays Jesus, and he helps him to get arrested. You can read that in Luke 22 verses 47 through 53. Mark adds a little detail about a nameless young man covered by a bedsheet who runs away naked when they try to grab him. Some people like to think and speculate that this could perhaps be an autobiographical note. John expands on Jesus' arrest by mentioning that the temple guards were somewhat confused about which person is Jesus, When Jesus then states, I am, as in, I am the one you're looking for, he uses the divine name of I am who I am, and the temple gods bow down. The arrest of Jesus and the subsequent fleeing of all the disciples is seen as a fulfillment of Zechariah 13 verse 7, strike the shepherd that the sheep may be scattered. Then Jesus is brought to trial, first before the Jewish leaders, as you can read in Luke 22 verses 66 through 71. During his trial, Jesus doesn't say much, but when he is asked promptly if he is the Messiah, he quotes Psalm 110 verse 1 and Daniel 7:13, essentially affirming that yes, he is the Messiah. In the meantime, Peter is busy betraying Jesus, as foretold. See Luke 22 verses 54 through 65. After the Jewish religious leaders found Jesus guilty, they bring him to Pilate, the Roman governor. This is necessary because the Jewish leaders did not have the legal authority to impose capital punishment. Pilate, before reluctantly giving the order to execute Jesus, first sends him to Herod because Jesus originated from Galilee. But in the end it is Pilate who has Jesus tortured and then executed. As part of his torture, Jesus is given a crown of thorns, a mocking gesture by the soldiers, not an official part of the punishment. Theologically, this reminds many theologians of Genesis 3:18, where thorns and thistles are said to be a result of man's original sin. We once again take a little detour to look at Judas, who suddenly becomes remorseful. He tries to give back the money that he had taken from the religious elites in exchange for betraying Jesus, before he goes off to kill himself. You can read this in Mathew 27 verses 3 through 10. Mathew then remarks that this fulfills yet another prophecy of Zechariah, namely the one found in chapter 11 verses 12 and 13. Then Jesus goes to Golgotha and is forced to carry his own crossbeam, at least until he no longer can. You can read this in Luke 23 verses 26 through 31. On the way there, he warns of dire times to come for Jerusalem, and repeats the words of Hosea 10:8. On the cross, Jesus speaks 7 times. You can read these 7 words spread out over Luke 23 verses 32 through 49, Matthew 27 verses 35 through 56, Mark 15 verses 25 through 41, and John 19 verses 18 through 37. And these are the 7 words. 1. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. 2. Truly, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. 3. Woman, behold your son. Son, behold your mother. Words specifically directed at his mother Mary and his close friend and disciple John. 4. My God, why have you forsaken me? Or, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. This is a quote from Psalm 22 verse 1. Then he says 5. I thirst. This is a quote from Psalm 69 verse 21, though it may also remind you of Psalm 22:15. Then he says 6. It is finished. And 7. Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. Which is also a quote, namely from Psalm 31 verse 5. Besides these 7 words, according to Matthew 27 verse 43, other people quote Psalm 22:8 to him mockingly. And when the Roman soldiers divide up Jesus' belongings, it is remarked that this is what is written in Psalm 22 verse 18. And in response to Jesus' thirst, it is interesting to note Psalm 69 verse 21, where it says, They have given me vinegar to drink. After Jesus died, he is buried. This can be read in Luke 23 verses 50 through 56. Now regarding Jesus' resurrection, there are 2 different traditions. There is the tradition of the empty grave, and there are the traditions of Jesus appearing to his disciples. We can read about the empty grave in all 4 Gospels, like in Luke 24 verses 1 through 12. And we can read about Jesus' appearances in 3 of the Gospels. In Luke, you can find it in chapter 24, verses 13 through 53, which includes the 2 disciples who were going to Emmaus. Then in Matthew, you can read it in chapter 28, verses 8 through 20, which includes what is called the Great Commission, and in John 20, verse 10 through 21, verse 25. This includes the doubting Thomas and the story of Peter and some other disciples fishing. Mark's Gospel most likely ended after chapter 16, verse 8, but the longer ending, of verses 9 through 20, includes appearances as well. Though all these Gospels have different stories, all agree that it were women who first saw Jesus. This despite the fact that a woman's testimony was often viewed suspiciously in the first century. Besides the Gospels, there is a reference to Jesus appearing for 40 days in Acts 1 verse 3. And there is a list of people who saw Jesus that predates all of the Gospels, and you can find that one in 1 Corinthians 15 verses 3 through 7. And finally, I also have to mention Isaiah 53 and the prophecy of the suffering servant. Though the New Testament authors never make the fulfillment of this prophecy in Jesus' death explicit, many later Christians did. And that is why you can read about Easter. I realize I just gave you a whole bunch of references, so to make it easy for you, I've put all of them in the description below and a link to a Bible website where you can look them up for yourself. Happy Easter, everyone!